late webinar series, webinar on professionalizing rural and small town water supply management. And we're focusing on the need to enhance external support arrangements. Next slide, please. So before we get started, we're going to do some Zoom orientation. So this webinar will be multilingual. We have translators translating from English into French and Portuguese. And just to make sure that you're on the right translation channel, if you could select the interpretation icon at the bottom bar of your screen and click on the language that you want to hear. So you should see the interpretation icon down there. If you don't see it, maybe it's in the More button in the list that you see associated with the More button. If you click your interpretation channel and select the language you'd like to hear, that would be great. And just to say that this webinar will be recorded, and the recording and the presentations will be shared afterwards. If you could introduce yourself in the chat box and just say your name, your organization, the country that you're based in the chat box. And then if you have questions throughout the webinar, we have the Q&A box as well. And we'd encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. But you can feel free to share any comments that you have in the chat box. So just toggle between those two boxes and put your questions for the presenters in the Q&A. And we encourage you to put your questions in as the webinar is proceeding. And we'll have a Q&A section after the presentations. And there'll be some polls within this webinar that we encourage you to participate in. And then at the end of the webinar, there'll be a short survey. Next slide, please. So to run through what we're going to be covering, I'll be giving some opening remarks and some background to a recent study that we've been doing on professionalization of rural and small town water services. A link to that study will appear in the chat. And then we'll have some presentations on the study findings from Bill Twyman from AgriConsult. And we'll be hearing about a model for supported community management from Mark Farrelly from the National Federation of Group Water Schemes in Ireland. And then we'll be hearing some experiences from Mozambique, from Iazal Teobi from WaterAid Mozambique. And we'll be hearing about the role of regulation from Peter Matali from NAWASCO, the National Water Supply and Sanitation Council in Zambia. And we'll have some remarks, discussant remarks from Joyce Magala from WaterAid Uganda, the country director of WaterAid Uganda, and then we'll have Q&A and closing remarks. Next slide, please. So my name is Vincent Casey. I'm the water security lead at WaterAid, and I'm just going to take you through some background to the study. Next slide, please. So what we're talking about here, the topic of this webinar is professionalization of rural and small town water services. And the term professionalization is often used interchangeably to refer to a few things, most notably strengthening community-based management by formalizing roles and responsibilities, moving away from a reliance on unpaid, untrained, and unsupported volunteers in water user committees towards employing trained and paid staff, adopting good managerial practices, and providing more systemic support to communities. It's also used to refer to adopting alternative management arrangements for services, most commonly involving public utilities and the private sector. So we're using the term in this webinar to refer to these contexts. Next slide, please. So some background to the topic we're covering. If we look at countries with sustained universal access to safe drinking water, we see they often rely on a range of different management arrangements for delivery and management and maintenance of service. These are sometimes referred to as models. And these models include variations of self-supply, community-based management, and public or private service provider utility provision, and various hybrids of these different models, different configurations of them. But what's common across all of them, including self-supply, including community-based management, or even utility-based models, is that they all need ongoing support in order to deliver sustainable, safe services. And in countries with universal access, you still see that self-supply and supported or professionalized community-based management remain critical to reaching rural populations. So we've commissioned this study essentially to highlight gaps and illuminate concrete actions for both WaterAid, the wider sector, to take to strengthen the sustainability of rural and small town services. The study features a synthesis report and also country briefs for the 10 countries that it focuses on. Next slide, please. And it's part of a series of publications that we've been working on over the last few years. These are some examples of them. You can find them on WaterAid's website. And as I say, this new synthesis report is now available. You can find the link, hopefully, in the chat. Next slide, please. And as I say, the study covers 10 countries: Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Ghana, India, Mozambique, Nepal, Nigeria, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Zambia. And the synthesis report you should be able to access, and hopefully next week, the country briefs will also be live. Great, okay. Next slide, please. So before we get started, we just wanted to do a quick poll, and Aline will launch that shortly. We're just asking which option within the poll best reflects the organization or entity that you work for. So if you could just have a quick look at that now and select the most appropriate option, whether you're a service provider, NGO focused on implementation, or an NGO focused on policy, a regulator, work for a government ministry or local government, a sector expert, or a multilateral or bilateral organization, or if you're representing the private sector, or there's an other field as well. Okay, that's the first question. And then just to get you thinking about the topic, in your opinion, what support is most important to provide to rural and small town water supply service providers to enable them to effectively manage water supply facilities? So we'll just spend a moment going through that poll, and then we'll flip to the results when we have a sufficient number coming in. Don't forget to scroll down to the second question and then to your answer there before you submit. Hopefully we can see some results coming in. Okay. Okay, the poll's disappeared, perhaps because maybe we're going to go to the answers now. Here we go. So we can see quite a lot of people are from NGOs, got some service providers here as well, which is great. Some regulators, government ministry, local government, sector experts, multi or bilateral organizations. So a good mix actually between the different organizations. And what's great is that all different organization types are represented here. So that's great. Excellent. And maybe we might see some answers to the second question, although we may not be able to project those at the moment. Okay, the poll I think is now closed. So we can go to, either we can go to the answers to the second question now, or we may come back to them, or we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Bill Twyman now from AgriConsult. He's a water and sanitation specialist at AgriConsult, and he's going to take us through the top level findings of the study on professionalisation of rural and small town water services, the need to enhance support arrangements. So Bill, over to you. Thank you.
Many thanks, Vinny, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So as Vinny alluded to, the study had three main objectives. The first was to map the management models for rural small town water supply services in 10 countries where WaterAid works across South Asia, and in particular in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We also set out to determine the extent of support that the service providers under each of these management models receive across a series of different dimensions. And then finally, in collaboration with the WaterAid country programs, different sector stakeholders, to outline to determine a series of recommendations for improving and enhancing the support that these service providers receive under the different management models. In terms of the methodology, we focused on 4 dimensions of support and within these 13 different indicators. One thing that I should say is that this was a really nice collaboration between the AgriConsult team and the WaterAid country programs, with the AgriConsult team first setting out the support responsibilities on paper, and then the WaterAid team holding a series of national level workshops in each of the 10 countries to determine the extent to which support was actually being provided as it was supposed to be. This was done using a 4-point scale that you can see on the bottom, which considered elements such as frequency, scope, and universality of the support provided. So the first task was to map the management models for rural small town water supply services. What this did was largely reaffirm the different management models that we know are applied in the sector, which we've grouped into 4 main categories: self-supply, community-based management, private service provision, public service provision, each of which have different variations apart from self-supply, and there's also some hybrid models as well, which aren't captured in this simple typology. A few key points to note in relation to these management models. The first of which is that governments increasingly recognise the need to professionalise the management of rural small town water supply services, and in particular the need for multiple models tailored to different contexts. I think it's increasingly abundantly clear that it's not going to be any one model that ensures universal access. It's going to be a mixture of models tailored to the different settings or the different range of rural areas that we see. What we see, however, is that government's desire to professionalise the management of rural water supply services is primarily centering on public utilities and private operators, and there's a common trend towards consolidation under both of these models, and a desire often to move away from forms of community-based management. Nevertheless, we know that the scaling of models based on public utilities or private operators is very much a long-term process, something which requires multiple decades often, and that community-based management is still the predominant model in rural areas, especially in more sparsely populated areas, especially for managing point water sources. What we also see is that forms of household self-supply and informal private operators are very common and present in most countries, but are often not formally recognised, and the precise scale of these models is often unknown as a result of this. Switching now to the study findings in relation to the support that service providers under each of the management models receive. The first point to note is that there's a wide-ranging set of actors that provide support to service providers. Some of these are internal to the service provider, for example, a higher level entity such as a national or regional body within a service provider such as a national utility. Most of these, however, are external actors, be it local government, but often holds the most wide-ranging set of functions, or a regulatory agency, a technical agency, the local private sector, or sometimes faith-based organisations and NGOs as well. One key overall finding is that across all management models, there's a common and often very substantive gap between the support responsibilities that we see in standards and guidelines and strategies in policies, the de jure, and the extent of support that's actually being provided in reality on the ground, the de facto. This is really shown in the table in front of you now, which shows the different management models across each of the countries and pairs this with the data that we got on the extent of support being provided. While we see some good examples, for example, around monitoring and regulation in Zambia, for the most part, the extent of support actually being provided is very limited and really highlights this considerable gap that we have between what's set out on paper and the reality on the ground. In terms of the more specific findings, one of the first things that really stood out is the fact that despite the predominance of community-based management of the formally recognised models, this typically receives the least support, and this is something which was consistent across most of the countries that we looked at, and also the 4 dimensions that we looked at as well: the technical side, the financial side, organisational development, and also monitoring and regulation as well. When it comes to models based on private operators and public utilities, here we saw more of a variation between countries. In some instances, we see that important progress has been made, that these service providers are starting to receive the support required on some of the dimensions. In other countries, we see that these service providers are largely being left to their own devices and that they're not really receiving any additional support to what water committees are receiving. So again, still this persistent gap between what's set out on paper and the reality on the ground. Finally, for this side, we also see that although financing is perhaps the biggest challenge facing the rural water subsector, there's still a consistent gap or consistent absence of financial support from financial actors to help service providers cover life cycle costs, which we know is very difficult in rural settings. And the financial support dimension was consistently the weakest of the 4 dimensions that we looked at. This was true across countries and across service delivery models as well. Again, reiterating that this is probably one of the hardest elements to work on within the subsector. Another point that really stood out was that local governments over the last 10, 20, 30 years have been given considerable responsibilities when it comes to acting as service authorities for rural water supply services, but this hasn't been paired with fiscal decentralisation and the capacity to perform these functions. And we really see this very considerable gap between the responsibilities given to local government on paper when it comes to supporting different service providers and the extent of support that's being provided on the ground. We did see some good practice examples of rural water supply regulation. These are, however, largely very nascent and centred on public utilities and private operators. This includes most notably examples from Zambia, but also some other countries such as Tanzania, Rwanda, that are taking important steps in this direction as well. Finally, we did identify some good examples of training programs to develop the capacity of service providers, but these were largely in more urban settings and mainly for public utilities. What we're seeing is a real shortage of government-led initiatives, in particular government-led initiatives in the rural water sector as opposed to for urban water. The figure on the screen in front of you now pairs data from the study on the extent of support service providers receive under each of the management models with the wide-ranging but admittedly very imperfect secondary data that we have available on the quality of service, normally reliability or water quality. What it seeks to do is to give a simplified overview of the link between the level of support that a management model service provider receives and the quality of service that is able to provide. This certainly does not represent a comprehensive summary applicable to all countries and management models. Naturally, there are variations and outliers, and it does not account for other important factors such as the technology being managed or the scale of service providers' operations. Nevertheless, what the figure does demonstrate is an important, I think largely predictable overall trend, which is that as the level of support that a management model's service provider receives increases, so does the quality of service that it's able to provide. Ultimately, when we're looking at a conclusion for the study, I think the key overall message from my side is that there's a real need to enhance the support the service providers receive. This is going to be crucial if we're going to professionalize management arrangements and accelerate progress towards SDG 6.1. What we also see is that the actions that need to be taken very much vary between countries. Nevertheless, we see 3 common and intellect steps that need to be undertaken to enhance the support service providers receive, and which of these steps is most appropriate to a given country, to a different management model, will vary based on the progress that's been made so far and the current situation. The first step is vision and strategy formulation, and this really involves working with government institutions to assess existing management models and the support required for different service providers. Based on the findings, institutions should then work with government to define a long-term vision for professional management with a costed strategy for achieving this. The next step is around management model strengthening and scaling of improvements. This really involves helping government institutions and development partners to implement initiatives and ongoing interventions aligned with the vision and costed strategy, and spans a range of different support dimensions, which will need to vary from country to country based on the current status of the support being provided and the priorities for the sector. The final one is around learning and refinement, and this really involves ensuring mechanisms are in place for assessing the impact, the strengths and the weaknesses of initiatives to support service providers, where necessary making additional refinements, where these are working well, promoting these for upscaling.
Great, thank you very much, Bill. Participants, please do put any questions that you have for Bill in the Q&A box before we hand over to the next presenter, who's Mark Farrelly, who's the Chief Executive Officer from the National Federation of Group Water Schemes in Ireland. He'll be taking us through an example of an association-based model for supporting community management in Ireland. Over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm delighted to talk to you today about the group water scheme sector in Ireland, which is the community-owned and community-operated drinking water sector in rural Ireland. But first of all, I just wanted to give you a brief synopsis of what the state of drinking water in Ireland is at the moment. So the population of the Republic of Ireland is about 5.3 million people, and almost 84% of people get their drinking water from Uisce Éireann, which is the national water utility. Uisce Éireann is the Irish for Irish water. Aside from that, around 10.4% or 500,000 people in rural Ireland get their water from domestic wells, which are self-supplies, in other words. And then around 200,000 people, 6.2%, get their water from group water schemes. So there are around 400 group water schemes in rural Ireland, and they form an integral role in providing drinking water to those across the country. And just one other note to make is that domestic water use in Ireland is covered in general taxation, so there's no actual charge for domestic users. So what are group water schemes? Well, they are community-owned and community-operated drinking water supplies. The people within the community own and operate the supply and provide drinking water to their members. As I mentioned, there's approximately 400 group water schemes providing water to 200,000 people. And I work for the National Federation of Group Water Schemes, which is the representative body for the sector. So group water schemes have varied complexity depending on their size and their source. Some have groundwater sources, others have surface water sources, and they range in size from a handful of schemes up to around 2,000 domestic connections, not to mention non-domestic connections and business connections as well. They all operate under cooperative ethos, meaning that everybody is an equal shareholder and owner in the scheme, and the members then appoint a voluntary board to run the scheme on their behalf. In more recent years, professional staffing has been encouraged, and this includes the delegation of functions to the private sector, in many cases, to manage the treatment water system or treatment system. All group water schemes operate their own network. Most will fall under regulatory compliance in terms of the drinking water regulations and other regulations that would apply to the daily operations of a group water scheme. And they must have a drinking water quality assurance system to qualify for subsidy. And this means that they are protecting their water from source to tap. And they are supervised by the local government. So there are county councils in Ireland, there are 26 around Ireland, and they are responsible for overseeing the group water schemes in their respective area. Then I work, as I mentioned, for the National Federation of Group Water Schemes. We're the representative body for the sector. So we are elected, well, I work as a staff member, but the board of the National Federation of Group Water Schemes is elected from the various county federations of group water schemes, who in turn have been, their representatives have been elected from the group water schemes themselves. So we offer different functions to the sector. We're the representative body, as I mentioned, so that means that we are dealing with government, with various departments and other organisations on behalf of the sector and advocating on their behalf. We also support and mentor the sector. While we don't provide technical guidance, we will give as much guidance as possible for the various things that may happen on the group water scheme on a daily basis, from a variety of things from treatment to managing staff, etc., etc. On that note, we offer training to group water schemes on a regular basis for a variety of different topics. And when there is more technical guidance needed, we would also facilitate training from technical experts as well. And then we also provide leadership to the sector in terms of interpreting new laws, etc., and trying to help them with their strategic planning over the years to look into new different areas that are important to the scheme in their daily operations. And finally, we also help informing policy. We sit on a variety of different expert groups and other such organisations when it comes to deriving policy around drinking water regulations in Ireland. So just to give you a history of the sector, how did it come about? Well, in the 1960s, there was only around 13%, or 1 in 8 rural homes in Ireland had access to a pipe water supply. Over that 20 years then, the next 20 years, there was grants given by the government for local communities to get together and do the work themselves to put a group water scheme in place. So these voluntary committees at community level have gotten together, put pipes in the ground, initially to give water to farms, really, was the main attraction, but then also over time, these connections were extended into houses and homes as well. And then in 1997, through a variety of different reasons, the National Federation of Group Water Schemes was founded. And one of the important things since then was to try and improve water quality within the sector in terms of making it potable for humans. Because as I mentioned, initially it was for farms really, so there was little or no treatment in place. So over the past 25 plus years, there's been tremendous investment into the sector to bring it into compliance with drinking water regulations. One of those funding supports is the annual operational subsidy for providing domestic water to group water scheme members. This falls under 3 different bands. It varies depending on where you source your water from. It also, whether you're in you've delegated treatment services to the private sector, and that must be in a state long-term contract. And there's also an additional subsidy for group water schemes of less than 100 houses who agreed to progress an amalgamation and rationalisation with other neighbouring group water schemes to try and form a bigger entity. The reason for this is that has been widely regarded as helping to make these group water schemes more economically sustainable into the future and provide more economies of scale for smaller schemes that would find it difficult otherwise to run a scheme given the enhanced amount of regulations there are nowadays. The second avenue of funding then is the multi-annual rural water programme. This is for capital projects such as treatment plant upgrades, network replacement, source protection and other such projects like that. So there are 9 different measures available under this programme, and it runs on a 3-year cycle. So just to give you an indication of the types of funding, there's 125 million euro in the budget for the 2024 to 2026 multi-annual rural water programme. So you can see that through sustained investment in the sector, there's been a huge amount of investment in the last 25 years since the formation of the National Federation. Over 1 billion euro has been allocated through the rural water programme to schemes, has been spent on capital projects, and over 250 million euro has been given out in annual subsidies. I should also note as well that schemes also have the opportunity to secure other finances through charging non-domestic use on their schemes. So for businesses, farms, etc., schemes will have a charging rate in place for those. This I'm not going to go into detail, but you'll get the slide sent out afterwards. This is just a more detailed slide on the institutional arrangements for funding the group water scheme sector. And you can see that the improvements, the funding has brought about great improvements in terms of water quality. As recently as 2004, 20 years ago, E. coli compliance on group water schemes was just above 60% in the annual compliance monitoring, whereas nowadays it's regularly almost always above 95% and hopefully getting towards 100% in the near future. I should also note just before I finish that the group water scheme sector we have found is a fantastic avenue for achieving community involvement at the local level. Ireland, the Irish government has declared a biodiversity and climate crisis, which obviously as many countries around the world are well aware of are also suffering. Not to mention there's been huge challenges in terms of water quality in the environment as well in Ireland. Almost 50% of our rivers and lakes are now classed as polluted by the Environmental Protection Agency. So the group water scheme sector is fantastic at achieving community buy-in on the ground in terms of efforts to protect drinking water sources, educate young people, and also we've been heavily involved in trying to address the biodiversity and climate crises through biodiversity enhancement and climate action projects throughout the group water scheme sector. And hopefully there's plenty more to come in the near future in regards to that too. Finally, I just wanted to mention that we're not alone in Europe in terms of having community-owned drinking water supplies. In recent years, we found out that it's actually something that is prevalent in quite a few European countries, and we actually formed the Informal Alliance of Community-Owned Water Services in Europe, or COWAS EU is the acronym, and we have been learning from each other in recent years and the way different services function across Europe. And here are a few photos from a recent trip to Upper Austria, which has a very popular community-owned water services sector, and not just for drinking water, but also for hydroelectricity and wastewater as well. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, for that. Thought it was particularly interesting, the level of subsidy that's provided to households under the model to ensure that people continue to receive rural services. Very interesting. So let's go now to the next presentation from Iazald Tayobi, who's the WASH Services Advisor for WaterAid Mozambique. Iazald, over to you. Thank you.
Dilton Tayob, I'm WASH Service Advisor, WaterAid Mozambique. I will start with the context for rural water supply in Mozambique. Similar to other developing countries, many small water systems have been constructed in recent years in rural area. Mozambique was not an exception. It actually doubled the coverage to 15%, which is still insignificant to meet water demand and aim of universal access. But this growth brought several changes that need to be addressed, such as limited technical and financial capacity of the private operators, poor reporting and monitoring service, performance service, dependence on public investment, limited sustainability, and regulatory challenge. I will highlight some points of our water supply sector structure It's a part of the Ministry of Public Works, Housing, and Water Resource. There are three main government entities created to manage different levels of water supply. First was FIPAC, created about 25 years ago, which is the set holding entity for water supply in charge of about 16 water schemes in provincial capitals. IES was created 10 years later. It is a set holder entity as well, in charge of about 150 small towns in district capitals. And it includes not only water supply, but sanitation as well. So all rural growth centers and community are under umbrella of DNASH. It's a National Directorate of Water and Sanitation, which is responsible as well for policy in all water sector. The rural water sector is where we as water aids concentrate most of our activities. There are some few overlapping between covering area for those entities. There's a regulator council, which is our, with mandate to regulate all water supply and sanitation service in our country. During this study, we identified 5 main management models, namely water communities, private operator that invest their own fund in constructing water system and make business, private operator with a concessional contract with the local government. This is the model where we as water aid concentrate most of our works, our support. Operator with responsibility delegated by asset manager entities, FIPAG and IAS, and direct local government provision in municipality. Although it's not most recommended model, but they still exist, neither due to the lack of private operator or other reason. Other management models, such as self-supply, it exists, but it's not significant, and we don't have consistent information about it. Some results for the study. It shows that we can see several NAA not applicable. It because by the policy, there is not support that has supposed to be provided, no external support. So private operator under this model has to conduct the activity, such as preventive maintenance and all operational expenditure. For the rural management model in Mozambique, very few support functions are defined across the technical, financial, and organization indicators, and several providers must perform the functions relatively in independent way. Some support on corrective maintenance may happen when systems are interrupted for a long time, or water quality monitoring when there's suspicion of any disease like a cholera or diarrhea. So local authority usually lack of technical, financial, and human capacity to effectively manage facility and provide the required support. So limited regulation and monitoring of rural water service provider is one of the biggest gaps. For the set holding entities like a FIPAG and IAS, based on delegation of responsibility to private operation, are the most regulated model and receive the most structured support. So priority that was highlighting during the study was expansion of the regulation framework and capital investment. I will just highlight some of water aid action to support the water service provider. Water aid has facilitated sector stakeholder reflection. The gaps affect sustainability of water supply service in rural area. It started with the national workshop, and it had been replicated for some provincial, and some good recommendation came out from these reflection sections. So in response of this recommendation of national works, water aid support, I joined training program to operator on report and monitoring as a part of Transform Wash project led by Tetra Track and funded by USAID, an extension of the duration of contract, which was one of the concern for 2 to 5 and 10 years currently. And we support as well clustering of the small water system. So water aid is supporting development of capacity building plan for the government entities to address barriers of provision of sustainability of water supply service. So water has agreed with the Safe Patch, which is a center training for water supply and sanitation, to give training. So we are extending this agreement and update the training package. So to be able to keep training the operators. And water aid is promoted exchange visit between operators, some from ProNazar, which is our local rural water and sanitation program, and some different program from Helvetage. So put all these private operators together for the cross-learning. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iazard. That's great. So I'm going to hand over to our next presenter now, Peter Matali, who's Chief Inspector working for NOWASCO, which is the National Water Supply and Sanitation Council in Zambia. Over to you, Peter.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm making a presentation on rural water supply and sanitation regulation in Zambia. I'm Peter Mtare, the Chief Inspector for the National Water Supply and Sanitation Council. I have a presentation outline, and I'll start with the introduction, then the cost of non-regulation of rural water supply and sanitation, sector professionalism through regulation of rural water and sanitation, benefits of effective regulation, categorization of water supply and sanitation service areas in Zambia, new institutional arrangements for rural water supply and sanitation regulation in Zambia, started in 2018, comprehensive implementation plan for rural water supply and sanitation, and then I'll conclude and present the lessons learned. Just also to indicate that Zambia is on the southern part of Africa, as indicated on the map. The population is around 20 million. The land area is around 752,000 square kilometers. The regulator for water supply and sanitation in Zambia is NOWASCO, where I'm coming from. Then we have 11 commercial treaties covering the entire country. In terms of introduction, just want to indicate that regulation is a key function for delivering sustainable water supply and sanitation services, both in urban and rural environments, which is done by NOWASCO in the case of Zambia. In the context of small towns and rural areas, it may seem difficult to introduce regulatory mechanisms that are able to apply national rules while also balancing potentially conflicting interests at the local level. For this reason, it is often necessary to adopt a mix of approaches to regulate water and sanitation services, relying on a mix of contracts, national level regulatory bodies, and in some cases, regulatory relays at the local levels. In this case, we can use commercial utilities who are licensed to regulate those that are operating under their licenses. The cost of non-regulation rural areas, as you can see in the picture there, is fragmentation of actors, lack of accountability, especially by license orders, high price for poor services, of course, with unregulated tariff, lack of investment, which means that inadequate infrastructure, poor sector performance, a situation where everyone is doing something but not much changes. When you look at sector professionalism through regulation of rural water and sanitation, we see a situation that we organize deconcentrated providers under formalized arrangements. We have clear mandates, strong accountability of mandate by license orders. We see actually standards, quality of standards, the regulated tariff also. The water quality, of course, is assured. We have minimum service levels with, of course, graduation to piped systems. And also we see attraction of finance for innovative solutions, infrastructure and resilience, comes also on board. Facilitate good sector performance, and this is a situation where everyone is doing something, and of course with impact. Benefits of effective regulations of rural water supply and sanitation, of course, cannot be emphasized, but stability in the setup of the market is assured, credibility in the decisions to improve sector performance. We see predictability in the setting of rules and guidelines, transparency in how service providers and enforcement operates. We also see consistency of actions for the sector. Looking at Zambia, we do have two main categories of areas. We have urban areas and rural areas. Under urban areas, we also have peri-urban areas, which in some countries are called them slums or other names. And then the rest of the country is rural. But within rural, we have got growth centers. These are centers or areas that are showing signs of becoming urban areas. And then also we have schools, we have got clinics and other institutions within the rural parts. Now coming to the new institutional arrangements for rural water supply and sanitation in Zambia. At the apex, we have the Ministry of Water Development and Sanitation in charge of policy development. And at the helm of regulations, we have NWASCO. And NWASCO, under the new arrangement, they have to issue licenses. Actually, we issue licenses only to commercial utilities. And any other service provider who wants to operate in a licensed area has to work under the license of a commercial utility. So any other service provider will sign a contract, whether lease, management, concession, with the commercial utility to operate on their behalf. But if it's a local authority, it's an MOU because of the nature of relationship that is there between a local authority and a commercial utility. A local authority in Zambia is a shareholder in a commercial utility. So that's the institutional arrangement, and that's what we are implementing. In terms of the journey of this rural regulation, we started with the institutional and legal framework review, which culminated into development of a provision and regulation for rural water supply and sanitation in 2018. And this was immediately followed by the amendment of the licenses for all commercial utilities in December 2018 to include rural areas. Then this was followed by the development of tools and systems, which are like standards, guidelines, and strategies. As you may be aware, we can't regulate or we can't provide a service without tools or systems in place. The next part was to establish the baseline for rural water supply and sanitation. Of course, we had to first of all review the NWASCO information system. We had to develop the data collection tool and also shared it with the other key stakeholders, including Zambia Statistics Agency, which they used actually for collecting data in 2022. And I should mention to you that data collection is ongoing. We also had to look at the capacities for NWASCO and commercial utilities. We instituted some consultancy. With the recommendation that came from there, we had to now embark on strengthening the capacities of NWASCO and commercial utilities, which started way back in 2021. And to date, the capacity development has continued. Dissemination and implementation of rural water supply and sanitation service provision framework, we had to actually come up with what we are calling joint implementation teams, which are teams consisting of different stakeholders so that we could implement the frameworks together and also high-level meetings with key stakeholders, including members of parliament. We started this in around 2020, and this has continued. In terms of implementation of service delivery models in rural water supply and sanitation, we started this in earnest in 2022, and we have continued. And from that point also, we started actual regulations and monitoring of rural water supply and sanitation so that we make progress. Finally, just wanted to mention that the lessons and conclusion, we have the aspect of clarity of laws and responsibility for everyone, which we believe is very key. And also, we realize that we need a special purpose vehicle to fund water supply and sanitation projects in rural areas in the initial stages, because we need to have infrastructure before commercial utilities or other service providers could move in. Provision and regulation tools and systems have to be in place even before you start providing the service or regulating the service. Data management must be enhanced, especially through GIS mapping, and also the issue of comprehensive surveys on the existing water supply and sanitation facilities and service delivery models in the rural parts of the country is very crucial. We engaged actually Zambia Statistics Agency for 2022 census to collect data for us for rural areas, of course, even urban areas. Business and service delivery models for provision of services are needed. Engagement of key stakeholders for consensus building is key, such as the local authorities, cooperating partners, and the civil society organizations. This is very, very important. Collaborative frameworks with key stakeholders need to be in place. If it's MOU, if it's certain agreements, those have to be in place so that they guide in terms of how you operate. Then for rural reform, there should be a leader in terms of steering the reform. And in this case, NWASCO is the leader, and we have continued to take the lead. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter. That was great. I'm just going to hand over now to our discussant, Joyce. So Joyce, it would be great if you could give some reflections on what you've heard so far in the presentations, particularly as Uganda is one of the countries where we see a clear government vision for professionalisation of the rural water sector based on a mixture of different models involving public utilities, provision of and a strengthened form of community-based management. So what role that's playing in helping to ensure the application of professionalized models, and also what you feel are further steps that are required for greater professionalization of rural and small town services in Uganda. Thank you, Joyce. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vinny. And it's my pleasure to share the role in application of professionalized models for rural water services. Listening to all the presentations, there are a lot of commonalities with what is happening in Uganda. And mostly all issues center around limited capacities for the private sector to engage in management of water supplies. There is also financing to really strengthen their operations, but also there are issues to do with regulation that really contribute to scattered efforts by all these different models for rural water supply. In Uganda, we've made significant strides in professionalizing rural water and small town water supply. This has mainly been achieved through development and implementation of diverse management models. For example, we have the National Water and Sewerage Corporation, which is the major agency that supplies piped water. We have the water authorities that have been established under a Water Act, and we have the community-based management system. We used to call it community-based management system, and it was upgraded to Plus because there is a lot of work that was done and learned from the first phase. And for example, in Uganda, we know that approximately 28.4 million people rely on water from deep boreholes, shallow wells, protected springs, and it's only about 11% that relies on piped water systems. So looking at these statistics, a lot of models had to be developed by government and development partners to improve on the functionality and reliability of the rural water systems that I've just mentioned. And the government of Uganda has taken it upon themselves to professionalize the management arrangements for water management through the community-based system, as I've already mentioned, and also focusing on enhancement of functionality and financial sustainability of the rural water systems. The district water authorities are, through the water service boards, are officially assigned for operations and maintenance. And these are qualified entities that they task like private service operators or area service providers, non-governmental organizations, and the umbrellas for water and sanitation. We also have hand pump mechanics. All these are different models to make sure that there is management of these water supplies. I'll give a specific example on the professionalization of the umbrella authorities, whereby WaterAid Uganda, through the strengthening of water operator partnerships, has improved access to water in one rural area in eastern Uganda, where a partnership with the Welsh Water and the Eastern Umbrella for Water and Sanitation has strengthened the organizational capacity of an umbrella authority through supporting staff capacity development. And this has really led to great significant results. We've seen improvement in asset management. We've seen increased water supply, which is reliable. And there's been a social inclusion because you look at these areas where the project has been operated, they are really deep rural areas where the vulnerable people probably could not even imagine getting water from the taps. So once these umbrellas or authorities capacities build with the limited financing, they are able to really increase and break through so that they can be able to run these water supplies. The professionalization doesn't go without challenges. There are quite a number of challenges, and it is a journey. One of the biggest challenges is the shortage of skilled service providers in the different areas. Much as there is the authority now that we can have service providers, we have a shortage of skills. And we also, so there is need for enhanced capacity for these area service providers. Another issue that is quite challenging is the overlapping mandates for the different actors at the district local governments. We also experience a lot of poor asset management, whereby the entities require a lot of training and capacity building for them to really be able to manage the assets. And finally, there is also weak regulation. I heard some of the presenters talking about this. Regulation is very critical because if this is not really taken care of, everybody comes up with their own standards, with their own tariffs, and this makes it very difficult for people to access reliable water supply. Finally, I would want to recommend a few steps that would really help as we professionalize these different models. And for me, I think it is very important for all our governments to really come up with a vision or strategy formulation, where they can collaborate to create a comprehensive understanding of what it means to have these management models tailored to specific demographic and geographical contexts. So it is also important that these models are very well costed, so that there is a strategy that talks about what it takes for them to manage the water supplies. And then we also need to manage, to strengthen the management models. In Uganda, we've taken a long time trying to understand these models. It's still a journey. So we need to really be very clear on what does it take for an area service provider to provide these services. They need incentives. The local governments also need incentives. And even external actors, such as the private sector, also need incentives to fulfill their roles in supporting this service delivery. Then secondly, the example I gave of WaterAid and the umbrella authorities, it takes a lot for the authorities to transit into fully fledged authorities to manage the water supplies. So we need to manage this transition and keep on supporting these authorities and the area service providers, such that we have these professionalized management models that will live the test of time and ensure that they have all the necessary functions that will enable them to work for a long time. They need financial support. They need to be trained and strengthen their technical skills, but also monitoring is very important to really see what they are doing. And finally, I think learning and refinement of these models is very critical. There should be mechanisms in place for continuous assessment so that we can really learn and also support these service providers' performance. So basically, for me, I really urge that we should really be courageous and be able to support these different management models if we are really to realize access to water by everyone in a sustainable manner. And that is what I've really learned from all the presentations. And we need to create platforms for stakeholders to share best practices, evaluate the effectiveness of the initiatives, and refine strategies based on observed challenges and lessons learned. And I want to really thank the organizers of this webinar, because this is such a platform that is helping us to learn a lot from all over the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joyce, for those reflections. That's fantastic. We're now at the point in the event where we can go over to some of the questions that were posed in the Q&A box. And some interesting issues are coming up there, particularly related to financing and the role of financing within this package of external support that's needed to support all models. I think, as Joyce has mentioned, and has been clear from the presentations, that financial support, subsidies are necessary for the viability of all models. So I'm going to put a question to that's been asked in the Q&A from Richard Carter. I'm going to put this question to Bill first. And the question is, if a wealthy country like Ireland has to subsidize its rural water schemes, why do we sometimes kid ourselves by asserting that rural water services in low and middle income countries can be financially viable or even profitable without that subsidy? So, Bill, have you got any thoughts on that? And first of all.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Vinny, and thanks, Richard, for raising a really good question. I think the Ireland example, also when you look at some other examples such as United States of America, some other countries in Europe, they really serve as a nice kind of reality check in terms of what we can viably expect to do when it comes to managing rural water supply services on a commercial basis. I think what I would stress is, no doubt there's a critical need to increase tariff revenue across most management models, to improve the ability of service providers to manage these models sustainably. But at the same time, we really need to be realistic around how far we can viably go with tariff revenues and to consider other sources of finance as well to manage these services effectively, and in particular, some form of subsidy. Whether or not that's through taxation or through cross-subsidy, possibly from some wealthier areas, utilities operating in urban areas, cross-subsidizing with rural operations like we see in Uganda with national water. But certainly I'd echo, I guess, Richard's point that we need to move away from just saying we need to increase tariff revenues, expecting us to be able to manage these services on a commercial basis, and appreciate some form of subsidy that we can blend into the financing model.
Great, thank you, Bill. I also just want to ask Iazald if you have any reflections on that question about the viability of these different models without subsidy. Maybe if you could give some reflection, Iazald, from Mozambique about the results from the study that look at the level of subsidy provided for different models and whether that's available, sufficient to ensure that services can be provided on a sustainable basis, either the private operator model or even community-based management. Any reflection you have there on the financial subsidy available?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there's no, I would say few, but I would say no support that is given for the private operator at different levels. For those who are on umbrella of the asset or the entity, they are quite better structured, minor of support. But if we go to rural area, so way is needed. So for so long, we have been talking about rural area, rural water supply sustainability. It's great. See, I completely agree. But in some areas where there are some people say that we have to go back to hand pump, but it's no longer visible. But we have all this minimum standard of health center that we have to comply with. Schools, so water system is quite, I will say, no way back. As Joyce say, and some of colleagues, I think it's Moses, wrote in the chat, so commercially of the rural water business, it's quite difficult. So support has to be needed. We have to be realistic. And this example of the Mark from Ireland, so it's which is the strong economy comparing to other developing countries. So yeah, we have to think seriously about it. And if we go to Mozambique case, it's quite the same for the developing countries. So, but I would say there is no support at all for this, for most of Activa, for example, for corrective maintenance. And in particular, when it's case of the climate disaster or some climate impact, climate change impact, so where this support is needed, so it has to be in place. So I will stop here.
Great, thanks, Iazald. And clearly, like what we see is that the issue of subsidy is quite a politically charged issue. I don't know, Mark, if you've got any reflections on this from Ireland in terms of the nature of that.
Definitely opening up a can of worms, talking that in the context of Ireland. There's not, I suppose, really for me to comment too much on, other than this has been, I think if anybody just Googles water charges in Ireland, you'll see it's been a very politicised issue over the years. Both, actually, it's one of the main reasons that the National Federation of Group Water Schemes was founded in the 90s, when water charges were abolished on public for those on public supplies by the government at the time. And then people who were on group water schemes who had to pay fees, but this was questionable for the group water scheme side, saying, how are we going to raise money and raise funding if we can't charge people for water? So that was one of the issues that led to the foundation of the National Federation of Group Water Schemes in securing those subsidy supports. And then in the mid-2010s, again, water charges were tried to be introduced by the government at the time, and that was withdrawn then, which again led to a more enhanced subsidy support to group water schemes. One of the things when we talk about the representation, us being the representation body for the sector, is to ensure that there's equity and fairness across all people, for everybody in Ireland, regardless whether you're on a group water scheme or on a supplied by the national utility. So the subsidy is there because to help group water schemes, because nobody is charged for domestic water use. There is a limit. It's 160 cubic meters. So if a domestic user uses more than 160 cubic meters, they the group water scheme can impose a charge on excessive use. But that's essentially how it runs in Ireland. Where I think we're unique in Europe, or one of the few countries in Europe with the way it works, in that the charge, I suppose, for water is in the general taxation rather than being something separate. So in a way, the subsidy is coming back from the taxation that people are paying in general.
Great, thank you, Mark. Interesting. Also, Peter, from NWASCO, do you have reflections on this with regard to tariffs and subsidies, the situation in Zambia?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you very much, Vincent. Yeah, for me, where I'm coming from, we are doing economic regulations and technical regulations. So in terms of tariffs, we also approve tariffs for anyone who is providing a service in Zambia. Now, let me start by saying that, when it comes to issues of tariff and subsidies, what is important is to look at economies of scale when you're coming up with entities to provide water supply and sanitation services. For us, what we have done is that every time we're looking at a tariff, we look at what we call a cost recovery tariff. Now, a cost recovery tariff looks at the entire commercial utility and also all the segments, the urban, peri-urban, and also the urban areas. So you need to differentiate a tariff such that for those that have got a muscle to pay, like the commercial customers, institutions, even those who are affluent, they pay much more. The tariff has been set in such a way that those that have got a muscle to pay more. It's not a cost-reflective tariff where each and every customer pays according to the burden that we impose on the system, but we look at that aspect. But for rural areas where they're under commercial utility, they use the same tariff as other areas. But of course, because of the way the tariff is set, it's a rising block tariff. We see that those that are in rural areas, they'll consume less and they'll pay less. But in terms of infrastructure, that you need support. In my presentation, I said we need a special purpose vehicle so that we put up infrastructure first, so that when you're talking about service provision, the infrastructure should be intact. So government, cooperating partners should come on board. In the case of Zambia, most of the rural areas now are funded using what we are calling Constituency Development Fund, which has been actually, for the past 3 years, increased so much. So it's about institutional arrangement that we put in place. But for private operators, what we do, let me just summarize by talking about private operators. If you have a private operator, we give them a tariff that to cover a cost. If you call Access Zambia, where they're operating one of the provinces, they've got a big area. We have given them a separate tariff and they're covering their costs. For community-based organization, OTA actually did a lot of schemes in Zambia, and they're being managed by communities. We have given them favorable tariffs. So what is required first is infrastructure, which should be subsidized by government, cooperating partners, civil society organizations. So it's possible that we can do much more with better institutional arrangements. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. So some interesting perspectives on this issue of financing and the need for subsidy. Interesting to check out a report that has been published recently on RWS, and I think Richard can put another link to it in the chat, called Who Foots the Bill, where some of these issues are discussed in more depth. But I want to turn now to the issue of regulation. There's a few questions that have, or points that have been made about regulation. And there's an interesting point from Bethlehem, which says that it's interesting that regulation is an overarching systems challenge across the countries mentioned in the research. I wonder if the lack of or weak regulatory mechanism is by design or a systemic governance problem. And were there any interesting insights on what the role of the private sector is in managing rural water supplies could be within regulation? And it also points to ambiguity in some policies there. So with that question, I'd like to turn again to Peter. And in your presentation, you've talked about the regulatory reform process in Zambia and where you are now. Perhaps could you give some insights on, some of the enabling factors that enabled you to get where you are with regulation in Zambia?
So thank you very much, Vincent. The issue of rural regulation, it's something that all the regulators were afraid of. Because of the nature of rural areas in Africa and in particular Zambia. So for us, we had to wait actually for 18 years because from 2000, when we started regulating, up to 2018, rural areas were not regulated. So for me, it's an uncharted area, which all of us, you have to move in with boldness. We should not be afraid to move into regulation because this is what most of the regulators have been avoiding. So it's a new thing, and with time and proper planning, we can move in and do proper regulations. In our case, the commercial utilities, for instance, are not restricted to provide services in rural areas. And also, as a regulator, we're not restricted to regulate rural areas. And in terms of the institutional framework and legal framework, it's quite clear. But we just needed to streamline the roles and responsibilities of all stakeholders because in rural areas, we find that there's so many actors. We have got NGOs, which are civil society organizations. We have got local authorities. We have got community-based organizations, private operators. But without a regulator coming in to be a referee to ensure that these players work in a formalized way, it becomes very difficult. So it's a journey that we have to start. I think for us, if you look at our journey, we started in 2018 and we are still continuing because we have to put a number of systems in place. Other than the legal framework and instrument framework in place, there are certain tools and systems which should still be in place for us to ensure that we do that. So any gaps have to be covered. Private operators in Zambia, for instance, in the law, they are quite encouraged. So there is no exclusion in terms of who should provide a service. What is just important is to provide that service in a very organized way. So you need to visit your legal framework, your institutional framework. That's the beginning before you even start looking at rural regulations. For me, that's what I have to say. Start from the legal and institutional framework. Make sure that each and every person participates in the process, and you'll be able to get there. We are getting there slowly as a country. I think when you come back again for a study, you'll see that actually we have made a lot of progress. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Peter. Okay, so there's an interesting question under Bethlehem's question, and that's posed to Joyce to just provide some reflections from Uganda on what the challenges are with community participation in some of these projects. So for the example that you gave of the umbrella projects or the umbrella mechanism in Uganda, whereby the umbrellas are supporting the management of schemes. Maybe Joyce, if you can give some insights with regard to that model and other models present in Uganda with regard to community participation.
Okay, thank you very much. With regard to community participation, with the area service providers, it's more of the enhanced community-based management system model. That is why they call it PLUS, because originally the power, all the role used to be left to the community purely. But then we all realized that communities could not operate and maintain these systems on their own. So even with the area service providers, they still get back to the communities and describe and define to them what kind of service they are going to provide to make sure that their water flows. So together with the communities, they set an agreed tariff depending on the area. There is no standard tariff that is set. So communities participate. There is the stakeholder engagement. That is very important. And even now, when you also realize with the National Water and Sewerage Corporation itself, much as they serve the bigger towns, but they've really enhanced their stakeholder engagement and feedback mechanisms to make sure that the water users are part of the decisions that are being made. And also, when we look at the umbrellas for water and sanitation, they cannot start to do any work. Actually, this work starts from the time the water schemes are being developed. Communities are part of the processes of engagement to agree and determine where the pipelines are going to pass, what their role would be, what their contribution would be. So by the time the umbrellas are taking over these schemes, there is a lot of awareness that has already been done by the NGOs that supply the water, all by the different government entities. So communities are still playing their role in terms of agreeing on the tariff, especially. So they consult on when they're establishing the tariff that suits the particular areas. One of the things that I would also want to comment on a little bit is on the regulation. I know in Uganda for the past more than 15 to 20 years, we've been struggling to see whether it would be wise for us to have an independent regulator. And that debate has gone on forever. It comes and it stalls. And the reason why there was the thought of an independent regulator was to make sure that there is that independence from the Ministry of Water and Environment, because at the moment, it's the Ministry of Water and Environment who is the regulator for the National Water and Sewerage Corporation. So that becomes a little bit contradictory because National Water and Sewerage Corporation is an entity of the Ministry of Water and Environment. So the discussions are still ongoing, though not in very high gear, but that is what, as a sector, what we are really looking at to make sure that there is autonomy in the regulation and functions are clearly separated from the parent ministries. It's still a journey, and I think the different models that are being proposed are kind of like offering us some hope of sustained water supplies through the different models, though there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Joyce, for those insights. That's great. In the chat, we can see that the issue of financing is still being discussed and debated, and so there are some interesting contributions there. One contribution, I think, is from Robert, is saying that we should be honest with ourselves about how commercially viable rural water is. If urban water services are not able to get full cost recovery, how can we expect rural services to arrive at this? And that's a very key and poignant point here, and an issue that is coming through in the study as well, of the need for this financial external support to sustain rural water services, and indeed in some cases urban. So that's great. We're going to do another poll now before we go to last reflections, and this poll is basically asking you what should be the priority first step for professionalizing the management of rural and small town water supply services in your context. So just think about your context where you're working. What's the key first step to take for professionalizing rural and small town water services? And we have a few options here. Assessing the strengths and weaknesses of existing management models, determining relevant best practices from comparable contexts, develop a strategy for professionalising the management of rural and small town services, increase the technical support, increase the financial support, develop capacity building programs, strengthen monitoring and regulation, upscale existing best practices, or other. So if you could just have a moment to answer that, and then we can move on. We'll just give you a few more moments to answer that with your reflections. It will be interesting to see where people think the majority of effort needs to go to really move forward with the professionalization. Okay, hopefully a number of answers have come in there. We can see the results here now on your screen. Hopefully you should see the results now. The majority participants are saying that it's about assessing the strengths and weaknesses of each management model within the country. Also some strong support for developing a strategy to professionalize management. Interestingly, the issue of financing is not coming up majorly, but we see from the discussion that it's kind of fundamental. And also developing capacity building programs for service providers is coming up quite strongly there. So some interesting results there, definitely. But again, a pretty good spread across the different answers. So that's great. Thank you very much for that. So before I give some closing remarks, I just want to open the floor just very quickly to our panelists and speakers. Maybe going to Bill first to give any final reflections you have on what we've covered.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Vinny, and thanks everyone for the great discussion. I guess my final remark would be the importance of putting government and government institutions, be that ministries, local government regulators, at the centre of any efforts to kind of professionalise rural water supply services and enhance the support that service providers receive. I think in the countries that we see, be it Tanzania, be it Zambia, be it Uganda, which have really started to move forward on this, we're seeing government playing quite a pivotal role with development partners then aligning behind that. So I guess a request or a plea for different organisations to up their efforts with government when it comes to defining the vision and then helping to operationalise that as well.
Great, thank you, Bill. And then Mark.
Yeah, just to follow on from Bill's comment, I think it's about the different levels of actors working together as well. In general, we would work in partnership with local government, who are the oversight body for the group water scheme sector, and then national government, who obviously help shape policy and provide funding to the sector. So when everybody's on a level playing field and the goals are clear, I suppose, in trying to achieve quality drinking water for people who are working hard in rural areas to achieve that. I think when everybody shares their goals and the issues that they might face and work together to resolve any of that, it show the history of what's happened in the Irish group water scheme shows what can be achieved, I think.
Great, thank you, Mark. And Iazald.
Yeah, hi, Vinny. I think we have already said so. It's really good that we start to talk about this support apart from the traditional talk about sustainability. So fool ourselves that it will be full sustainable in the rural area. So we have to be realistic, and I think this conversation has already started in this way, and we can learn from some countries with a similar, I would say, similar economy somehow, like Uganda and Tanzania, our neighbors, and have a courage to make change and move ahead.
Great, thank you, Azad. And Peter.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you very much. The issue of rural water supply and sanitation, we have to make sure that we professionalize the provision of water supply and sanitation in rural areas. The issue of financing shouldn't stop us from making it a professional sector. The mixture of tariff and subsidies should be encouraged. A right mix is encouraged. So let's not lose sight, but let's make sure that we go ahead and professionalize the provision of water supply and sanitation services. Of course, those sustainability issues is something that we can take care of. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. And just very quickly then, Joyce, 1 minute from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Building on what Peter has said, I don't want even to say just professionalization. I want to say, let's build on the small incremental steps that we've achieved to make sure that all these different management models that have proven to really deliver are strengthened in terms of capacity. The other things will fall into place.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and thank you to all panelists and speakers for your wonderful presentations and reflections. It's been a very interesting session. I think the very key message to take away from this is that all management arrangements need support in terms of technical, financial, organizational development and regulatory aspects, and a number of different management models are required to reach universal access. There's no one size fits all. So thank you all for joining. And if you want to check out the report and other related resources that have been put in the chat, please do so. And we look forward to seeing you again in other sessions. Thank you very much.